Welcome back. Today I want to talk about 3 important lessons that we can all learn from the life of John Feinstein, a legendary sports figure who recently passed away at the age of 69. John was, in my opinion, the most prolific sports author of a generation. He was also a broadcaster. And so I want to talk about John today and talk about 3 lessons that we can learn from the way he conducted his business and the way he acted and carried himself in his career. John was someone that you could watch on TV, hear on the radio, and fortunately for me, when I was broadcasting at West Point for Army basketball, he became a friend when he wrote a book about the team and the Patriot League. And then we were able to talk after that as well and maintain somewhat of a friendship. But I want to talk about 3 things that John Feinstein showed and 3 things that we can all gather, whether we're a sports broadcaster or not. The first thing, John was a master at being authentic. He was a master at being himself. And anyone who broadcasts with John will tell you that you never knew exactly what he was going to say. And I think that was part of the magic of John Feinstein, not only in his writing as a columnist, author, but as a broadcaster, a color analyst working for Navy, Army. When I became introduced to John Feinstein, it was in the 90s when he appeared regularly on the ESPN program on Sunday mornings called Sports Reporters. And basically, Sports Reporters was the precursor, one of the precursors to what we have now, sports talk radio, or some of the studio shows where guests will argue back and forth about points, whether it's Around the Horn, whether it's Pardon the Interruption, those kinds of shows. John Feinstein was part of the Sports Reporters with Dick Schaap and some of the others, and that was the kind of program it was. It was appointment viewing on Sunday mornings on ESPN, and they would have a topic, and 4 or 5 guys would go back and forth. Mike Lupica was another regular on that program, and you never knew what John was going to say, but it was authentic. That's the thing that was great, is that the John Feinstein you got on the air was the same as the one you got off the air. And the great Marty Glickman used to talk about that quality and being authentic. And he said, you always want to be exactly who you are on the air and off the air, because that's how you know you're giving your true self to your audience. And John was. He didn't care what your opinion was on the matter. He was going to share his, even if it clashed. I mean, we disagreed on some things. We agreed on a lot. And at the same time, I always knew I could learn something from him. I remember asking him years later, after those Army days, he appeared on a radio show that I was co-hosting, and I was asking about Tiger Woods, and I was asking about the Masters and golf and what Tiger had meant. This was in the early 2000s, where Tiger was still very much in his heyday. And John had some great insight and some opinions that were surprising and that you didn't hear a lot, somewhat critical at times about Tiger.
You forgot Rick's, thank you for that introduction, but you forgot Rick's favorite one of my books, the one that he's in. That's The Last Amateurs, when Rick was doing the Army games.
That was a fantastic book.
Thank you, Rick.
John, Tiger Woods was a guy that when he first burst onto the scene, I know you had thought maybe he was a little too motivated by money. What do you think about him now in his first 2 wins? Do you think he has a shot at that Grand Slam?
Oh, I think he does, Rick. I still think he's too motivated by money, by the way.
A couple of the other great golf books you've written, A Good Walk Spoiled and The Majors. Since you began following this sport, do you feel that Tiger has really given it a boost and brought it into the mainstream now that maybe some of the younger people are following it?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about his effect on the sport, Rick. You just have to look at the numbers.
John, the book that you're working on right now that's actually going to come out in October was all about the 1977 punch with Kermit Washington and Rudy Tomjanovich. When was it that maybe you sat back and said, this will be a good idea for a book? How did that come about?
Well, Rick, actually, it came about because Kermit wrote a piece in the New York Times, and I happened to read it, and he talked about how his life had never been the same.
He was a professional, and he would never say something on the air that he wouldn't say to someone's face. He was authentic. He shared his opinion, And it wasn't done to get clicks. It wasn't done to draw gasps and to be shocking. He simply thought about these issues that were in the sports world and gave his opinions. And they were principled opinions based on his experiences and his knowledge of the subjects, which in many cases was much more than anyone else, and you could learn a ton from him. So we can all learn from that, whether we're sports broadcasters, whether we are simply professionals in other businesses. Being authentic, I don't care whether you're a teacher, a sales professional, a business person, a project manager, it doesn't matter. Being authentic is going to help you in your career. John Feinstein was excellent at that. The second thing that John Feinstein did so well, which helped him write 40 books. Let me think about that. 40 books. He was a regular columnist for the Washington Post and elsewhere. And as I mentioned, he appeared on the air in so many places. He was a master at building relationships. And you could see him put the effort into it. So when he met someone early in his career, he stayed in touch. He fostered that relationship. And so then as the years progressed, his Rolodex was unparalleled. And so that's one of the reasons that he was able to write these books like Season on the Brink, just in one of the top sports books of all time, chronicling Bobby Knight and the Indiana Hoosiers. But 40 books about golf, minor league baseball, the Army-Navy rivalry. Oh, his book about that was fantastic. Wrote a book about Kermit Washington and the punch. Oh, he could span the different sports and build relationships in each one. So he would spend a year, 2 years, 3 years writing a book and getting to know all the people involved. I mentioned the year that he wrote the book about the Patriot League called The Last Amateurs, where he basically embedded himself in the Patriot League. I was with the Army basketball team broadcasting on the radio, but he followed the entire league and wrote a book about that season, documenting just how different it was from the big programs that he had covered in his other books. You know, he came from, I mentioned writing about Indiana and Bobby Knight, and he wrote about the ACC and all the big rivalries, Duke, North Carolina. But here he was spending a season in the Patriot League. And he would get to know the athletic trainer. He would get to know the sixth man off the bench for Navy. He would get to know all these stories to share with his readers and help them really get a feel for the team, for the Patriot League. And that's why he was such a good author, because he could build those relationships. And he would come in during that season, spend a day or two, and then he'd come back maybe a week later, spend another day or two. So you got used to seeing him, and he became like part of the family. And that skill of building relationships was something that gave him the ability to get the knowledge, the insight that he needed, to gain context about what he was writing about. And so then after watching him do that for that year, you can look at all of his books and say, you can see how he did it, because he was able to build those relationships, gain trust, and then use those relationships to share the story with his reader. And that's one of the reasons he was the best author in the sporting world in our generation. So number 2, he was able to build relationships. And you can do that. You need to do it in the broadcasting industry for sure, because if you're trying to move up the ranks, you're going to need relationships. You're going to need to network. You're going to need feedback from others just to know how to navigate things. And so that's a great thing for broadcasters and for anyone building relationships. And the third thing that John Feinstein did so well, which I saw firsthand, was helping others. He was someone who, for example, during that year when he would follow the team, I remember we played at Duke. And so I got there early. I was setting up my equipment. And I remember John came over and we were talking. It was hours before the game. And he said, "Would you like to go down and say hi to Coach Krzyzewski?" I hadn't met Coach K. he brought me in, and the three of us talked basketball and a lot of other things for at least an hour in Coach K's office. Now, John didn't have to do that. He had known Coach K for years. But he made a point to come over and ask if I wanted to go, because that's the kind of person he was. And he also gave me a tour around the Duke campus in his car. And he pointed out this place and that place and some notable buildings on campus. And I come to find out later that he had done that for other broadcasters as well. And that makes a lot of sense, because my friend and former broadcast colleague, when we heard that John passed away, we were sharing some of the stories, and my friend's name is Bill Rogan. And Bill said John was a champion for up-and-coming broadcast professionals. And I think that really says it properly. He was always someone trying to highlight you and lift you up. I've heard from other broadcasters who say that they know he tried to help them in their career. I know quite a few of them, and he always made a point to try to put the spotlight on the young up-and-coming broadcaster, to try to highlight them, try to help them get ahead. A few years after I had met John, he appeared on a radio show that I mentioned that I was co-hosting for an ESPN affiliate. And I would ask questions, and John would continuously bring it back to me by name during the interview, and then mention a couple things that he knew about my history and bring it into the interview. I was trying to ask him questions about the sports world, and in this particular case, I mentioned it was Tiger Woods and golf. And he kept bringing it back to, well, Rick, as you know about this, and then he would answer the question. But he didn't do that accidentally. He did that because he was really, as Bill said, a champion for the up-and-coming broadcaster. And since his passing, I've heard and read some great stories in similar regards about how he tried to help. I remember, as you know, we talk here on Sportscasters Club about the books that I've written that are on the website, sportscastersclub.com. When I went to write my first book, I talked to John about it, and he had some great advice. He gave me some great advice that I was able to follow, and ultimately self-publish that book, and then a bunch more about baseball, about sports broadcasting. But he was a great sounding board for that, and he would give you the honest input. He wouldn't tell you something that you wanted to hear. He would tell you the honest truth, because he was always willing to help others and highlight a young up-and-coming broadcaster. So those are three things that I remembered. If you remember John Feinstein, whether as a broadcaster, as an author, let me know in the comments what you thought. Let me know what your favorite book of his was. Obviously, I'm partial to The Last Amateurs because, as John said, I was in that book just because I was broadcasting for the Army team that year. But I thought Season on the Brink was just fantastic, about the Indiana Hoosiers and Bobby Knight, and you'll have to read that book. I'm not going to give away any of the secrets there, but let me know in the comments what your favorite was, and let me know if you have any other memories of John Feinstein. He was a legend in the business. He'll be sadly missed. He was a great guy and certainly missed, but I just wanted to share some of these things that can help you, things that I learned from John, and I know we can all learn from him as well. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.